Hello everybody and welcome to this evening's very exciting event with New York Times best-selling author Mateo Askaripour. My name's Zoe and I work at the Reading Agency. For those of you who don't know us, the Reading Agency is a national charity that's mission is to tackle life's big challenges through the proven power of reading. We deliver our programs in partnership with public libraries, publishers, schools, hospitals, prisons, and many other organisations. And over 2020 to 2021, we reached over 1.9 million people across the UK. So I'm delighted to introduce our author, Mateo Askaripour. Mateo's work aims to empower people of colour to seize opportunities for advancement, no matter the obstacle. He was chosen as one of Entertainment Weekly's 10 rising stars to make waves, and his debut novel, Black Buck, was an instant New York Times bestseller. He lives in Brooklyn, and you can follow him on Instagram and Twitter at Ask Mateo. We're also delighted to be joined by Zoey Dixon, who will be speaking to Mateo about the novel and its biting satire of office culture, its razor-sharp examination of race and ambition, and much more. Zoey works at Lambeth Libraries in London and has served on the book selection panels for numerous lists and awards, including the Reading Agency's Summer Reading Challenge and Phillips, Carnegie and Kate Greenway Book Awards. In 2020, she was named as one of the Bookseller Rising Stars. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to hand over to Zoey, who's going to kick off our event.
Thank you, Zoe, and thank you for Mateo for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, both of you.
Great. So obviously the very first question is going to be, could you tell us a little bit about your book and the inspiration behind it?
Sure. So I'll give you the spiel. Black Buck is about a young man named Darren. He's living in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, New York, United States, and he has a loving mother, caring girlfriend, supportive best friend, and he has this neighborhood, and his neighborhood has him. Now, Darren is also working at a Starbucks in Midtown Manhattan, 34th and Park to be specific, not too far from Times Square, to give you a location that more people may be aware of. And he's working at the Starbucks, and one day this suave, good-looking CEO comes in and he says, "Give me my regular." But for some reason, Darren says no, and he sells him on another drink. This man, impressed, invites Darren all the way up to the 36th floor of the same building where his office is located, and he extends an offer for Darren to join his elite sales team. Darren reluctantly agrees, but he soon finds out he is not the only black salesman there. He's the only black person in the entire company. So he goes through hell and back in order to make it to the top. And once he's there, he has power, status, money, all of those great things, right? But he says, hold up, I don't want to be the token black guy. So he hatches a plan to help other people of color infiltrate America's tech startup sales teams, redefining what it means to be a minority in the workplace. And for those who read the book, you know that it goes global, goes across the pond, over there in the UK to a few other locations as well. The inspiration came in part from my own experience. I worked in the world of startups and sales. I didn't have to do any research in terms of what it meant to sell something, what it meant to work at a fast pace, as they would call it, rapid growth startup in the middle of New York City that has raised millions of dollars and is growing exponentially. Part of the inspiration also came from the fact that my first two manuscripts, I'd read two manuscripts before Black Buck, two completely different books when I was trying to gain a foothold in the world of publishing, and I was trying to break in. Those first two manuscripts didn't go anywhere. You know, I'm not a formally trained writer, so I was figuring out what it meant to write, what it meant to be a writer, who I was even as a writer, and back then, and even now, of course, right? It's a lifelong pursuit, who I am as a person. So because those first two manuscripts didn't go anywhere, and I learned a little bit more about the industry, I said, you know what? I'm not going to try to write something that is palatable and something that is easily digestible by anyone who consumes it in the industry. I'm no longer going to try to pander to agents or editors, but instead I'm going to write the book that I want in the way that I want for the people I want it to resonate with. And fortunately, the idea for Black Buck in a more, let's call it, radical form came to me at the end of 2017. And then the beginning of 2018, I began to write it. And now I'm here speaking with you.
So you talked about, I've seen that you wrote about this book specifically for Black people as well. How is that different from your previous writing that you've done? How do you tailor it to a certain audience?
Sure. Well, it's more so that I had Black people in mind while I was writing the book. Those previous books, right? I don't even know who the audience was, to be completely honest. I think the audience was those two books. Agents told me were young adult. I didn't even know what young adult was when I came into the industry. Right, the protagonist of the first manuscript was 17. An agent read it and said, "Mateo, you need to make this character 16, and you're writing what's called young adult." I said, "What's young adult? I don't want anything to do with a young adult." You know what I'm saying? And then I did a little bit of research, and I conformed those two books to fit that genre, but it didn't work because while I respect young adult, and I have many friends who write young adult, and I read a few young adult books a year, I don't read young adult all the time. You know, it's not my main genre. It's more so adult fiction in some form or the other. So those first two books, again, I think the audience, and it was so long ago, I think the audience was for a young individual who felt lost or out of place, right? And who was looking for their place beyond where they grew up. With Black Buck, talking about the audience, and you know, I try to be clear with this. I'm grateful for anyone who picks up the book and reads it, right? Because that's time that you're not going to get back. And I hope that anyone who reads it will be able to take something away from it. But when writing the book, right, I said I wanted to write it in the way that I wanted for the people I wanted to resonate with. I wanted Black people, first and foremost, especially those who have been in these types of scenarios where they are one of the few or the only person in an environment. Doesn't even have to be the workplace. Could be a sports team, a religious organization, institution of higher learning. I wanted them to know that they're not paranoid, they're not overly sensitive, and that they're not crazy when they perceive something to be amiss. So holding that at the forefront of my mind allowed me to write it with humor, without holding back, right? When you read the book, hopefully you found some of it funny, maybe not all of it. Yeah, because I know some of it.
Shocking.
Yeah, right. Some of it definitely toes the line of like, is this funny or is this offensive, right? But having Black people in the forefront of my mind gave me that freedom to make some of these jokes. Because if I was thinking of non-Black folk as I was writing it, the question would be, are they laughing with me or at me? Are they laughing with us or at us, right? So I just felt free to say what I wanted to say. Beyond Black people, right? I was hoping that anyone who has ever been marginalized in some form could relate to Darren's journey. And fortunately, I've had many people write to me, you know, strangely enough, many like middle-aged or older white women who say, you know, I am not a 22-year-old Black man. And I'm like, I didn't think you were, Sandra. But she says, I'm not a 22-year-old Black man, but I have been the only woman on an executive team, right? I have been the only woman in a certain scenario, and I can relate to what it feels like to be the odd person out. And that for me is a win, right? So that's a little bit about where the inspiration came from. And
do you feel that satire gives you more space that allows you to do that, to have, rather than kind of a straight, very down the line novel?
Honestly, Zoe, right, when it comes to labels and the label of satire, it would be very easy for me to slap that label on this book and hide behind it, right? Or slap even the label. It is fiction, right? So no one can sue me. It's fiction. But it's easy to hide behind these labels, right? And say, oh, it's just a book. Oh, it's just satire. Sort of in the way, and I hope this isn't a stretch, I don't feel like it is, when people make some offensive statement and they say, come on, it's just a joke, right? I could actually picture almost everything in this book happening. And I've also found from putting this book out there that absurdity is in the eye of the beholder. There are so many people who say, Mateo, what do things like this actually happen? And more often than not, the people that are asking those questions don't look like me or you, you know? They can't relate. It's so out of the purview of their reality. And that shows how divorced they are from the experience that so many of us have. But when it comes to satire, I knew that I was writing satirical elements or including satirical elements. I knew that there were absurdist elements. One thing that almost no one brings up, and this for me is wild, is that there's a pig in the office, right? That for me was one of the most absurd things ever. There's a pig that gets bigger and bigger throughout the entire novel. People really don't bring that up. So again, I knew that I was containing those elements, but I have rarely, I think maybe only on one occasion, ever actually called this satire. I think that it contains satirical elements. By the end of the book, it turns into a thriller of sorts, which I hadn't anticipated that
it
when
was
I was
like,
writing.
Oh, it's a bit like a revenge thriller.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
and
it's like
I didn't even anticipate that. As I was writing it towards the end, I said, hold up, this got thriller vibes. I didn't even know that. I hope that I could pull this off. There's romance. It's a comedy. There's drama. There's tragedy. It's a cautionary tale. There's so much that's rolled into it, Zoe. So for me to just call it a satire, I feel as though would be limiting its potential and my intentions. But if other people want to do that, cool.
Yeah. So going to the title of the book, Black Buck. Now, as someone from the UK, I wasn't aware of what it meant until I Googled it. I just assumed when I first started reading it, it was to do with the fact that he had embraced this name given to him, Buck, because he worked in Starbucks.
Yeah.
And he just called Black Buck. And another person thought it was to do with Black people and money, because bucks, dollars. But that's not what it is. It's a racial slur. So what was the intention of calling your novel Black Buck?
You're not wrong, Zoe. The title has multiple meanings.
Yeah.
Both of those that you mentioned, with the latter being what I would say is the more important one, right? In terms of one of the messages in this novel about what it means for Black and brown folk to accrue some generational wealth, to accrue some funds, to no longer allow ourselves to be financially disenfranchised. And it is a complicated discussion to have. You know, over there in the UK, I was grateful enough to have The Guardian discuss my book and myself. And the author had raised the question of how possible is it for someone to seek liberation in a capitalist society, right? That's a question that someone's going to have to answer themselves, you know, aside from the context of this book or not. So that was something that I wanted to hit on, a question that I wanted to raise. But when it comes to the title itself, even over here in the States, a lot of people of a younger generation aren't aware of the term. I have a lot of older folks, Black and non-Black, who say, whoa, I saw this title and I was like, what is this? You know, some people think that it's like some steamy, like slave play narrative, you know, for those who know about the controversial play by Jeremy O'Hara's, they don't know what's going on, right? Other people just had no idea and they might have been turned off, and other folks were intrigued and they gave it a chance. The title, for those who aren't aware, as Zoe said, is a derogatory term, and it was for the enslaved male back in the time of slavery or enslavement, who the white enslavers believed was unruly, was a brute, was going to burn down the plantation, steal all the piggies, the horse and the cattle, kill the women, or you know, pillage the women, what have you, and had to be put down by any means necessary. So when I was thinking about this book and the title, the original title was Fixing the Game. And that also had a double meaning for me, that the game that we live in of trying to get ahead in society is fixed, not in our favor or favor of people who look like us. And that's not some victim mentality. I mean, it's a fact, even though, you know, I hesitate to say this. I know that there was a report that came out in the UK with the government saying that.
Yes.
You know, but I don't live there. So I try not to comment on things that, you know, that's on you. But anyway.
The reality is very different.
So the thought was that, fixing the game. And then I said, you know what? I want something a little bit harder. And I had a discussion with my agent, who's actually here. Shout out to Tina. If you see a name Tina in the attendees, that's my agent. And I said, you know what? I might call it Buck, because throughout the novel, I already knew that he was going to be renamed Buck. He was going to be given that name by Clyde in the workplace. And I said, why not just call it Black Buck? Because in my mind, he isn't burning down these corporations literally, but at least for a time, he's burning down what they symbolize. And through naming it Black Buck, it felt for me as a reclamation of sorts. So that's where the title came from. And let me tell you, there was definitely some people from my publisher and other booksellers who were like, we don't know about this title. And I'm pretty chill. I'm easy to work with. But when there was a question raised about we don't know about this title, I wrote an essay to them, telling them that thinking about the title, you know, it wasn't willy-nilly. It wasn't just me trying to be provocative for the sake of provocation, right? There were all these intentions that I just laid out for you. And then afterwards I said, okay, we got it. You know, no more questions asked. But I know that that stemmed from some booksellers feeling uncomfortable with the title.
Yeah, thanks. So Darren, or Buck, as he...
What do you want to call him? What do you call him?
I like to call him Darren because I don't like Buck.
Okay. Wait, the character? You don't like the who he becomes?
I don't become who he becomes. Obviously, he does slightly redeem himself by the end. But my question is, you know, he can be very unpleasant at times throughout the novel. He does some really horrible things.
Yeah.
With Mr. Rawlins, that was heartbreaking. What
like the worst.
Yeah. I mean, we understand he's grieving, but that's for someone to do that to someone. I don't want to give too many spoilers away for people who haven't read it yet. But how do you write a character as complex as Darren, who is unlikable quite often, but is also relatable and sympathetic, and you want him to kind of get on and achieve and be a success? How do you do that? A big question.
Well, I'm thinking of an experience I had in a couple months ago, we'll say, where I was at an event and I sat down next to a woman who is connected to a very powerful individual in this world. And she said, she's white. And she said, I just really loved Black Buck. And I said, thank you so much. Like, I appreciate it. I was like, this is cool that she was really feeling it. And then she said, I just loved it, Darren. And I said, really? A lot of people don't like him for a majority of the book. And then she's like, what do you mean? I said, I mean, the guy does some horrid things. You know, I'm trying to not judge him as I wouldn't want to judge any real person, right? But she just didn't really like catch it. Again, that's her read, because everyone has a different reference point. And I truly believe that art, especially this novel, is a mirror serving as a reflection of where someone is in their lives, right? Yeah. When it comes to writing Darren, I had to get out of his way. I had to get out of his way and allow him to be who he wanted to be. I think that for some people, it might be strange for me to describe these characters as my children, right? Because I'm only 30 and you have a character like Mr. Rawlings or Ma or whomever who are older, right? But that's what it felt like, that these characters in a way were my children. And sometimes I don't have kids, okay? So I'm speaking at a remove, right? Yeah. And I got 4 brothers, and I got a mother and a father, and they raised 5 crazy boys in one house. So I feel like I might have picked up on a little bit of my mom's stress. But I believe when you have children that you can't always control what they want to do, just like a friend, just like a significant other, someone you care about. You can't control what they do at all times or ever. And you might be able to influence it, but you need to get out of their way so that they can grow, even though you might not always agree with those choices. Yeah. So as I got to know Darren more, right, the first draft was 168,000 words. That's like Moby Dick. That was a big book. And the book that you read, that little paperback behind me, I mean, it's not little, it's like 400 pages, right? It's about 110,000 words. So I had to cut out a whole other book. But from draft to draft, I got to know Darren more. So because I got to know him more, then it's like draft 3 or 4, I might write something, I might make an edit, and the character that I know of Darren at that point is like, no, I wouldn't do this. It's like a little ping you get, you know, no, I wouldn't do this. But then the difficulty, and this added in, I believe, complexity, is that ping of like, no, I wouldn't do this, but maybe that's why I should do this at this point. Okay. Because in reality, we act out of character. People say you're acting out of character. What's tougher on the page is that some people always want it to be a pretty clean narrative from A to Z, or a nice bow on the ending, right? Like, and that would push it from fiction mirroring reality to, I believe, fantasy. So with a character like Darren, with any character, I had to get out of their way. I had to try to understand them as I would understand you as a real living, breathing, brilliant person. And not exert my authority as much as possible. So that's how I wrote a character like Darren. I think that I also had to mind my own emotional depths. And even if I was afraid of what I saw looking back at me, push through that fear in order to bring it onto the page.
Do you think that the consequences that Darren faced at the end, did you feel compelled to do that morally, or like he had to do what happened?
Ooh.
Yeah.
Zoey, whoa. I don't know if anyone's put it that bluntly. Like, did I feel like I had to right the world back so that its moral compass was pointing in the right direction?
Yeah.
It's funny because over the past week or two, I've been discussing the ending a lot. And I mean, we got like 28 people here. You know, I would love to hear if people who have read the book think that it was worth it, right? Because that's the question posited at the end. Reader, colon, you know, was it all worth it?
Yeah.
Some people say yes. A lot of people say no. No. Okay. Let me not just say no. The answer is more complicated than that.
Mm.
The book was so outsized in its proportions as to what happened, right? In the span of like a year and some change.
Yeah.
And that was intentional. I wanted to start the book off at like 20 miles per hour. Don't get me to do the kilometers per hour conversion right now. Just everyone sorry, it's not my fault. I grew up in New York. So 20 miles per hour. And then I wanted to ratchet it up that by the end, it was like 250, right? And it would have felt inauthentic. It would have felt fake. It wouldn't have felt true to Darren's journey and the journey of these characters if it would have just been like, oh, Darren and Soraya have a kid. Darren's, you know, out and about. He's back to being best friends with Jason, the character who people who haven't read it, I don't want to give it away, but a character, let's just say, towards the end, like everything's good with them. And, you know, he's just living his life, and maybe he expands the happy campers and he's living in a nice place and he's giving back this, that, and the other. That wouldn't have felt real to me. I wanted there to be, you know, as I believe Newton's second law is, an equal and opposite reaction to everything that had just taken place. And this, for me, what happened at the end was that. There are a lot of people who say, Mateo, I did not like the ending. I don't like how it ended. I don't like what message this might be sending. And then other people say, I didn't like the ending, but I understand it. Then other people are like, no, that feels right. To your question of morality, I was trying to express that not always, but at times there are consequences to what we do in this life.
Yeah.
And especially the way that we interact and treat people. You brought up Mr. Rawlings. That was one of the hardest scenes to write, you know? And I think that it would have, again, been too easy if that never manifested again in Darren's life in some way. You know, it would have just felt off to me. I wasn't looking to punish Darren, but I think more so I was looking to depict the reality that I've seen play out again and again, where sometimes consequences come back on people and sometimes they don't. But again, I wanted this to also be a story of redemption, because I don't believe, you know, I work with previously incarcerated people, and I don't believe that anyone is the worst thing that they've ever done.
Yeah. So do you think that Darren is a better person at the end of the novel? If there was to be a sequel, I know there isn't, but if there was, would he have learned his lesson about, or do you think if an opportunity arose, he might repeat the same mistakes?
It's hard to say. You know, I don't think that we always learn a lesson once. Sometimes it takes two, three times. Sometimes we never do. And even if Darren, you know, were to move forward in his life, it doesn't mean that the remainder of his days is going to be pristine and clean. I think that that's an unrealistic expectation. I actually wouldn't want his life to be like that. I don't want anyone's life to be like that. My dad once said, no one, you know, can drive down a straight path their whole life. You know, there's detours in the road. my belief though, and sometimes I hesitate to speak on behalf of Darren because it feels so real to me, but my belief is that where he ends up allows him to be freer than where he was when he was working in that office.
Yeah.
It's given him time to reflect and process on all of the things that happened, again, in the span of about a year and some change, and that have turned him into a wiser, more empathetic individual. But that's not to say that he can't make more mistakes, do more egregious or heinous things, or hurt more people. I mean, you know?
Absolutely. I mean, it's written in kind of a self-help style. He's imparting some wisdom and knowledge. And reading it, I went from the very beginning, where he kind of likened people like Martin Luther King to salespeople. They're selling you something. I kind of didn't like him from that, but as I read it more, I was just like, no, salespeople are only in it for themselves. It only benefits them. How can you liken Martin Luther King to a salesperson?
Sure.
But as it went on, I kind of understood the lesson he was trying to impart from what he had learned. And I could see what you were doing with the novel. But that's the character. What did you want to impart from the reader? What did you want the reader to take away from Darren's journey?
Shout out to this man, Robert Wynn, in the chat. He said the ending was contorted. It definitely was. You know, some people put this book down and they got whiplash. You know, they need a neck brace afterwards. Like, what just happened? I wanted, again, people who can see themselves in the narrative, who can see themselves reflected in Darren's journey, to know that what they feel is real in these instances, right? When they feel as though something is off, it probably is. And it's just so easy to be gaslit, right?
Yes.
We live in nations, especially in the West, that are constantly trying to gaslight us, saying, it's not bad at all. What are you talking about? Things are so much better than they were. This, that, and the other. I mean, the statistics show that there is still room for improvement in many places, especially dealing with racial equity and equality. So again, I wanted any of those people that could relate to Darren's journey, Black or not Black, male or not male, to know that they're not crazy. And I also wanted other people who might be a bit divorced from Darren's own reality and his experience to ask themselves, who are they in this narrative of the novel? And beyond that, who are they in this narrative of the fight for progress? And what role are they playing in it? So those are a couple things I wanted people to take away. More concretely, when it comes to the sales aspects, I was hoping that someone would be able to read this book and walk away with a basic understanding or a basic proficiency of sales, right?
Yeah.
Doesn't mean that you can walk into an interview for an entry-level sales position and immediately get it, but that you would be to an advantage. And even in a non-professional aspect, or at least a non-sales professional aspect, I was hoping that people would be able to glean some insight into how to better advocate for themselves and those that they love, how to champion their causes. Because again, going back to not hiding behind the label of fiction, as Darren, the character who's writing this book, writes in the author's note, I too believe that, yeah, Martin Luther King was a salesman, that Rosa Parks was a saleswoman, Nina Simone, all of these people, Oprah, Fred Hampton, Malcolm X, all of these individuals were salespeople, and that they were selling their vision to millions of people who looked like them in order to put their belief in them, and also to so many people who opposed them. And I think that Martin Luther King was one of the best sales people ever, maybe even more so, well, probably more so than Malcolm X, because his form of selling resulted in policy change, right? Resulted in material differences that were written into law. Yeah.
Has there been a difference in the reaction from audiences from the US, the UK to other countries that may have published? I know you're publishing in a few other countries as well later this year.
Yeah, we're coming out in France in March, Anyone who speaks French, please buy it and then let me know if the translation is good, because I speak 10 words of French, so I wouldn't know, you know. And then it's coming out in Spain at some point too, and hopefully other places down the line. Yeah, reactions. No, there hasn't been many differences actually, you know, which I think is showing the unifying factors across nations, across borders, that racism is borderless, you know?
Yeah.
And I've had people in the UK, just as in the US, say, thank you. You have helped me feel seen. Again, I'm not here left wondering if I'm making half of this stuff up as I go to work in central London or what have you. I know that there's a world in the UK beyond central London. I know. I got family, Sheffield, Birmingham, Manchester. Shout out to my Jamaican folk out there. As well as non-Black readers who say, you know, this was illuminating, this was engaging, this was something that was even informative. So a lot of the reactions have been the same. I think that what I found in the UK, and again, this is no judgment, right? I'm trying to be careful because I wasn't raised there. Even though I had a wonderful time there last year, there are some people who say that it's a bit tougher to articulate their thoughts and their opinions and their feelings publicly because it's not as ingrained in the culture as it is over here in the States, right? And there are more likely people who will say, as I saw a few months ago on whatever channel, BBC, I'm not sure, give us examples. Give us examples of what you're talking about. And this constant gaslighting and people trying to invalidate your experience because they want it cut dry in order to believe it, right? And the onus is on us to educate. So I have had a couple of people who are like, as they would say, bruv, it's wild out here, even in ways that you can't imagine. Yes. And when I went there, I did see certain things that I was like, whoa, you know, there are aspects of living in the UK as a Black or a person of color that in some ways, and it's not the trauma Olympics, but it's just different than over here. You know, so yeah, some differences, but not many. There's been a lot of just common denominators. And again, I'm just grateful for anyone who reads it. And I'm also just grateful for all of you here who are in attendance listening. If you've read the book, I thank you. If you plan to read the book, I thank you. If you don't want to, well, thanks for coming. Thanks for stopping by.
So going back to the characters in the books, did you have a favorite or a least favorite character to write? Like, or did you like really enjoy writing Clyde, who is completely hideous from the beginning? But kind of like, was there kind of some pleasure in writing a character who's that nasty?
Like Clyde? Nah, not really, to be honest. I didn't have a lot of pleasure in writing Clyde, aside from his interactions with Frodo, the character.
Okay, yeah.
Because
I'm kind of glad to hear that, by the way.
Yeah, Clyde. It was difficult to write some scenes. I mean, especially with Clyde and the overt and also subtle racism that he exerts on Darren in some really bizarre and absurd ways. Like, that wasn't easy for me. You know, it wasn't fun. And it wasn't fun to then later on in other scenes have Darren turn and hurt people who had loved him unconditionally. But a character like Frodo was fun to write. Frodo was just, you know, hilarious. He's not a bad guy, but he represents mediocrity and how, being mediocre, despite that, can still gain entrance into certain doors if you have a certain privilege, rather than someone like Darren who could be said to be, you know, talented or have some potential, but he has a higher climb to get to where he needed to be. So Frodo was really fun. The character of Rose, I would say, is maybe my favorite. Okay. I love Rose.
Yeah.
She just doesn't hold back. She doesn't hold her tongue when speaking with Darren. She wakes him up, and Rose's character isn't there as a device to wake Darren up. That's not her value in the story. She's a fully formed character, a fully formed woman all on her own. But I just sense so much power in her, so much emotional, you know, quotient, so much in terms of leadership and influencing others by example. So yeah, Rose is definitely one of my favorites. Rhett was a complex character, and he was someone who there was pleasure in writing him because of how complex he was, right? Rhett, you know, I would ask you, do you think Rhett's a bad person? Anyone who's read the book, I would ask you too in the chat, do you think Rhett's a bad person? Why or why not?
I think because of his ignorance, he ignores things which are happening. I think inaction makes you a bad person. He's not necessarily bad himself, but I think inaction, turning a blind eye, does make you a bad person. Letting Clyde abuse, because it was abuse that Darren went through in the office. I can't, you know, I was reading it, I'm like, I would have walked out that first time paint was chucked on me, you know, I would never have been able to, you know, stand that. But I can understand why Darren did. He's a complicated character. It's not a black and white. I don't know what does anyone else thinks. If you could put your thoughts in the chat, that would be nice.
It's not black and white, as you said, Zoe. Yeah, it's not, and that was on purpose. You know, I wanted to make these characters feel fully formed and in a way that you can understand where they're coming from. Yeah. Clyde, I don't know if his perspective came through as much as I wanted it to. And while I will say that Clyde is racist, I think that more than that, he's hurt.
Yeah, he was very jealous of.
He's jealous. And he's hurt. And he sees that this big brother, who's this messianic figure in this organization, Rhett Daniels, has now cast his eye on this nobody, right? This kid from Bed-Stuy who was just slinging coffee. And now he's receiving all of the affections of this man who Clyde had loved. So Clyde, in my opinion, again, is racist. I don't want to say he's not, right? To say and do the things that he did, like that's coming from somewhere. But I believe that he looked at Darren and said, I want to hurt this guy, so I'm going to weaponize his blackness against him. In the same way, you have Jason, who, not in the same way of like racism or weaponization, the same way you have Jason, who is Darren's best friend, and he's always on the corner doing what he thinks he has to do in order to help his mother and help himself and his livelihood. You have Jason, who had grown up with Darren, who had protected Darren in certain ways, who had educated Darren in certain ways, and then Darren all of a sudden isn't even stopping by on the corner on the way to the subway or the tube, right, to say hello to him, to dap him up, to say what up. And Jason, in my opinion, is hurt. But that hurt manifests in a very negative and harmful manner, because it's very hard for men, especially men in the Black community, to feel hurt and then say, yo, bro, I'm hurt. Yeah, I'm hurt right now. So the book was also commenting on the more negative effects of masculinity when we don't embrace communication, when we don't embrace vulnerability.
Yeah, that was one of my takeaways. It is the environment that they work in is very toxic, because even the women who work there, they kind of play up to this idea of how you should be in the office, and I mean, I don't know the corporate world at all. I'm a librarian. It's not as cutthroat.
You're a rising star, according to the Bookseller.
I am a rising star, according to the Bookseller, yeah. But obviously, I deal with the public, and I face much more microaggressions from them, and a lot more toxic interactions from them. But yeah, it's really interesting how you included, you know, commentary on capitalism, the American dream, how it means to be success in America, and obviously race being an important one. And there's a lot going on. And you said in your announcement at the end that your next book's going to be completely different. Why is that? And could you tell us a little bit about your next book, if you know?
Oh yeah, most definitely. Why is that? Well, I don't want to do the same thing over and over. You know, I think that there are some writers or some artists, right, musicians, painters, or whomever, who have a style, they generate a style or a voice, and then they cling to that, and then they create an audience who loves that, right? We know that Stephen King is going to be writing thrillers, right? Or mystery. And not to say that's all he's going to write. I love his memoirish craft book on writing. And I could be limited in my understanding of Stephen King, but I don't know if he's ever written a romance or a comedy. Maybe his books do include those elements, though, just like I was talking about at the beginning in terms of Black Buck. But for me, I'm here to grow as a writer.
Mhm.
I'm here to take risks. I'm here to write things that give me pause and make me wonder, will I actually be able to pull this off? That's just the type of writer that I want to be. Someone like a John A. Williams, someone even a more contemporary writer, Ya Jesse, right? Her most recent books her 2 books that are out are very different from one another. Colson Whitehead, right? Colson Whitehead writes whatever he wants.
Yeah.
So that's the type of writer I want to be. I just want to write whatever I want, and I want to continue to challenge myself. That's not to say that I won't write other books in the vein of Black Buck. I have 2 to 3 other ideas that excite me. Young Black man from a certain place or whatever, very different than Darren, and a different voice, goes into an environment of some sort, maybe not even the workplace, and he learns, and then this, that, and the other, right? And the settings are very different, and they're wild, and on the face they're not the same, but it's sort of this like David and Goliath type of conflict. I have a few of those ideas that maybe I'll tackle down the line, but again, I'm trying to grow. So my second novel, we already released the description last year. It's called Invisible Faces, and it's about a young invisible woman. She's invisible, see-through. Yeah. She is part of a group of people who are invisible, and they're basically treated as second-class citizens, and there's a dominant population who aren't invisible. And she was an orphan, but she had a brother. And when the book takes place, it's in the present day for her, but 3 years ago her older brother just disappeared. Her older brother, whom she lived with, he disappears. And she had gained an apprenticeship with what we would call an inventor. He's like the premier inventor of the world. So she's working with him one day, and then what pops up on what we would call the TV, it's totally different, is that their president of sorts was murdered, and the chief suspect is her brother. And she's like, whoa, what? My brother? So now there's a political upstart who is saying, we're going to find this invisible murderer within 5 days, and I'm going to become the next, president. So he's going through debates and all of that. And then there is a law enforcement officer who is saying, my reputation's on the line. I got to find this guy, this lowly, invisible guy. I got to find him in 5 days. And then there's this young woman who's saying, hold up, I'm not going to let my brother go down like this. So even though she has a whole world against her, outpowering her, she takes it upon herself to find her brother to save him. So that's a bit of the book, called Invisible Faces. Hopefully it'll come out in 2023 if I do my job. If not, then a little bit later.
Sounds really interesting. Lots of political intrigue and some science fiction and lots of different genres all mixed up there. I look forward to reading that when it comes out. Thank you for answering my questions. We're going to take some questions from the audience now. So we've got a question from, well, I'm sure you've seen, from Kimberly. Kimberly, has ordered your book, can't wait to read it, but they would love to know how many versions and edits of the story you wrote until you got this story. And they love the thriller vibes and everything you've described.
Thanks, Kimberly. Really appreciate it. Thanks for coming through and ordering the book. Yeah, so I wrote 4 drafts until I got an agent, right? So I said the first draft was 168,000 words. That's because again, I don't have any formal training as a writer, so I just allowed myself the freedom to write whatever I wanted on the page. But I wasn't going to query an agent with 168,000 words. That they were, Tina's here, my agent. She probably would have just been like, delete, So from the first to the second draft, I worked to get rid of a lot of unnecessary subplots. Or secondary plots and a few characters that weren't central to the story that I was telling. Because at the end of the first draft and when I reread it, I had a clearer idea of the story I was telling and the shape that it was taking. So that then allowed me to refine and delete. So I think I got rid of about 27,000 words. And then from the second to third draft, got rid of a few more words. And then I had my third draft and I started to pitch this out to agents. This was towards the end of 2018. But then due to a few different inspirations, I said, you know what? I'm already breaking the fourth wall in the author's note, and I want this to read as a sales manual. Why don't I break the fourth wall more conspicuously? And I will bold direct addresses to the reader, and I will break those out from the previous and the next paragraph so that it's in your face and that people who are familiar with manuals of any sort, I guess a car manual, different training programs or whatever, it'll feel like that, a bit didactic in a way. So that only came in the fourth draft. And then that's the draft that I sent to my agent, who I eventually signed with. And then from there, we worked on probably like 2 or 3 more drafts, and then we sold it. And then after we sold it, we worked on, I'll say, 2 to 3 more drafts. Now, there are some writers who I know who say, Mateo, I'll write 14 words a day. And that's good for me, just 14 words. They're very tight writers. Me, I found that I want to get it all out on the page and then refine. But what that equates to is
a lot of editing.
10 or so drafts, right? Which I'm okay because I'm not averse to work. So yeah, that's a little bit about the drafts and the edits, Kimberly. Thanks for the question.
It's I imagine that when you worked in the more corporate, you've kind of taken that same work ethic to your writing, like you work very, very hard. And
well, when I first started writing, I was still working at that company. This was in 2016, and then I quit. And I was trying to place that first manuscript. I was trying to gain representation with an agent, and it didn't work out. And what I told myself is being able to sit down in a quiet space and write is a cakewalk compared to what I was doing. This loud, noisy atmosphere, very testosterone heavy, making 200 or so calls a day. Towards the end of my career, I wasn't making calls like that. I was more so managing people, but the stress of all of that and the fatigue, when I began writing, it felt calming. It felt freeing. So I did carry some things over for sure.
We've got a few questions from some anonymous attendees here. It's great to hear the whole process of how you curated Darren and got to the final story. My question is, have you got your next novel in mind, which we've heard about? And they would love to hear how you go from idea to final product after your experience with Black Book.
Hello, anonymous. So as you know, I got my next novel in mind. I have the next 2 or 3 things that I want to write in mind. But those could always drop out, right? This second novel I had in mind that I'm working on now, I don't know, 2 years ago. And then I thought that I was going to write a third novel, and it's going to be about this, a fourth novel, and it was going to be about this. Now those ideas that I had for the third and fourth novel, I'm just not as interested in them. So for me, I'm constantly coming up with ideas. I'm grateful and privileged that the ideas always come, right? Because I'm allowing myself to not judge myself when ideas pop into my head. So if I'm walking down the street and I see a construction worker, at a manhole, and he's peering down, I might think, what if that guy fell in there and then got stuck and the lid covered, and then he had to survive, for a couple days because no one was able to find him. I could say that's a stupid idea. That would never happen. He'd be screaming. And then maybe no one would hear him though, because the train is going by and the cars are rumbling. So what I'm saying is I'll write that idea down.
Yeah.
I might play with it for a little bit, because I'll never say that's a stupid idea. It doesn't matter who's saying anything stupid. No one's going to see this. So I'll play with an idea like that. And if I find myself in my notes app, I use an app called Evernote. If I find myself jotting down more and more notes for an idea, and then months later, when I think of that idea, it still excites me, or I can't forget the idea, then I say, this may be something that I could spend years with. Because the investment when writing a novel, as I'm sure you all know, it's years, even if you write one quickly. I wrote Black Buck, the first draft, in 5 months, and then a couple months to get into the state where I could then get an agent. And then 5 or 6 months later, we sold it. But then there's about 9 or so months until it actually comes out. and then you spend a year or more talking about it. So you have to really be feeling an idea and enthused and passionate when you think about it, and just excited, electric, because you are going to have to sustain that passion, and it's hard over the course of years. So any idea that pops into my head, I'll write it down, I'll jot down notes, and if I'm still excited about it months later or a year later, or whenever my time frees up that when I can work on it, then I will pursue that idea. And there might be ideas that are competing for my attention at a certain time, and I'm going to go with whatever feels most right.
Thanks. So another anonymous question. I found Black Buck both enjoyable and important with the themes weaved throughout. It's hard to find a book which does these two things. I'm interested to know what books you read growing up and how these impacted your writing style.
Thank you. Whenever anyone asks this question, I think they're looking for something like profound. I mean, I grew up reading Clifford. Clifford the Big Red Dog. I grew up reading, yeah, it's a good book. Frog and Toad, Dr. DeSoto. When I was 10, one of my aunts gave me a couple books in the Left Behind series. For any of you familiar with that, about the rapture, those scared the hell out of me. As I got older, I was reading James Baldwin, a bit of Toni Morrison in high school. I was lucky enough that we actually read like a couple books by Black authors in high school. For me, reading James Baldwin, I believe, had a profound effect because I was so angry when I read his books. And I was angry for like at least a week afterwards, to the point where I would have to be careful with the James Baldwin that I consumed because it affected me so deeply. So when it came to Black Buck, I wanted people to not just feel one thing, but many things. I wanted people to feel so much, because I believed that whatever they thought about the book would likely evaporate, you know, weeks, months, maybe a year or a couple of years later, but what they felt would live longer in their hearts. One book that had an influence on Black Buck was The Sellout by Paul Beatty, which some of you might be familiar. He won the Man Booker over there in the UK for The Sellout. And I read The Sellout before I began writing Black Buck. And I said, whoa, first of all, how did this man write this book and get it published? It is so, people think that parts of Black Buck might be offensive, pushing the envelope, whatever. Paul Beatty takes it to a whole nother level. Now, a lot of this on the face is, as some people would say, pure satire. I don't even think Paul Beatty likes that term himself. And certain aspects are a bit absurd and would be labeled as farce. But he wrote that, and I read it, and I said, he not only got this book published, but he won an award for it. And I felt as though reading that book gave me the permission to not hold back when it came to Black Buck. At one point while I was writing Black Buck, I met a very prominent author named Jason Reynolds, who I now count as a friend. And this was in a coffee shop, and I was just a young writer, 26, and I bought him a cup of coffee, and I was asking him all these questions. And I said, have you ever read The Sellout? And he's like, yeah, of course. And I said, well, I want to write a book that, you know, also goes a little wild and, you know, is big, huge proportions. And I'll never forget, he took a sip and he said, I can't imitate his deep voice, but he's like, you got to be good enough to do that. And so that, for me, while The Sellout gave me permission to write Black Buck, I also knew that I had to work very hard to land the plane, because otherwise it would just have been a book of wild mush. You know, maybe some people still perceive it that way. I don't know. That's not the way that I look at it. So those are a couple books that had an influence on me. Heads of the Colored People by Nafisa Thompson Spires. I love that collection.
That's really great, yeah.
Americana by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. I think that book is a perfect book. And when I read it in 2017, I loved the simplicity of the language. So I think that maybe subconsciously also gave me the permission to write a book in a very conversational tone, you know, without trying to be overly verbose or fit into the academic, you know, arm of the literary world, or try to replicate not just dead white men, but even someone like Toni Morrison, who writes with such eloquence and verbosity. Americana was a book that was written with very simple verbiage, but that packed a punch. And that simple verbiage, I believe, made it so accessible to the reader. And I wanted to do the same with Black Buck.
Thanks. So we're going to have a few questions more. We got Robert Wynn. Do you envision a book being produced as a movie?
It's just so tough when you can and can't say things. If it's going to be anything, it's going to be a TV show. I'll say that.
Well, I think if some people might Google it, they might find out some more information like I did earlier.
Really? There's something out there?
Yes.
Something I said?
Yeah. So it's going to be a TV
Yes,
show.
it's out there now. I don't even know.
I thought I read earlier when I Googled it. Just
probably did. You probably did. There were times when I was feeling myself and I said, I don't care. I'm just going to let it all go. But yeah, if it's going to be anything, it's going to be a TV show. We're working to turn it into a TV show.
Yeah, I'll look forward to watching that. It'll be quite interesting to see on the big screen. Would you have anyone in mind who you'd like to play Buck?
I'm thinking the actor Kelvin Harrison Jr. He's been like the main person that I envisioned when I began thinking about a cast. Kelvin Harrison Jr. was in a movie called Waves. He was in a movie called Luce, Luce, across from Octavia Spencer. He was in a TV show called The Godfather of Harlem. He has just been in a handful of things. He was in that Netflix show, Netflix movie Monster. I think that Kelvin Harrison Jr. could do it. Actually, another person who I had in mind was Damson Idris, right, over there in the UK. But I don't know if he would be right, because when I think of him, I think of one of my favorite TV shows, Snowfall. So I don't know if I would be able to think of him as Darren because of that, but he's one. People have floated around the name of Jarrell Jerome, who was in When They See Us, and he was the middle character of Kevin in Moonlight. I look at him being more so as Jason. But yeah, those are a few people I have in mind. Stephen James. I believe he is a Canadian Jamaican actor. He was in If Beale Street Could Talk. I could see him playing Darren. Yeah, a few people.
Oh, we'll just have to wait and see, won't we?
Yeah.
We have a few more questions. These are about the characters in your book. Mohammed Sheikh says, "Hey Mateo, there are some very, in capital letters, interesting characters in the book. Did you base any of them on real people?"
This is Paperback Mo, as he wrote in
Paperback Mo.
You can't see it, but he wrote that as a second question. Mo was I used to do these Instagram lives every Friday. I did it for 8 weeks straight, 2 months when the book was coming out, and I still do them sparingly. So anyone who ever wants to keep in touch, follow me at Ask Mateo on Instagram and Twitter. But I was doing one of these lives, and the great thing about these lives is anyone comes on and goes live with me like this for about an hour. Different people, it's a rotating cast, and it's never planned. Sometimes I know who's coming through, but usually it's very improvised. Mo came on, and Mo was the first British person that I didn't know that I spoke to about my book. And he was so excited. And I think that he was located in Leicester. Back then, I was still calling it Leicester. Right? He was in Leicester, and he was telling me about HMP institutions, and I was bugging out because I was like, "What? You got prisons over there called Her Majesty's prisons?" He was educating me and telling me so much, also about the world of healthcare. So that's a little bit about Paperback Mo, a legend. I love you, brother. Thank you, man. Thank you for being here. All right, there are some very interesting characters in the book. Did you base any of them on real people? Yeah. That's all I'm going to say. It was being recorded, and there's a disclaimer at the beginning of the novel saying that this is fiction. Any characters based on real people or otherwise, inspired by them maybe, but not exactly them. But I will say point blank, yes.
Very short and simple.
A couple. Someone earlier asked, or you asked, excuse me, about Clyde, right? Is Clyde was Clyde based on one individual? No, Clyde, for example, is like a composite character of that type that many of us know. Someone like Soraya, I can say this comfortably without any hesitation. Soraya was based off of one of my exes. When I was on the come up in the world of startups and sales, she was by my side, very much so like Soraya. And when I was writing Black Buck, I would read instances of Black Buck to her every night, and she was instrumental in letting me know if something was hitting in the way that I wanted. So shout outs to her.
Whitney asks, what reflections of yourself are in any of the characters? if at all?
I would like to think, honestly, there's a piece of me in all the characters. I don't know if I would have been able to write them compellingly and for them to feel real if I wasn't imbuing them with a bit of my own essence based on my own experiences, right? In a character like Clyde, right? There are aspects of who I was when I was working in the world of startups, right? Of like no nonsense, get to work. You know, my own limitations. I used to have people come to me and say, Mateo, I need help, this, that, and the other, things going on personally. And there were times, I would like to say that I cringed, but we learned from these types of experiences. There were times when I would say, you know, just pick up the phone and that's going to fix everything. Just pick up the phone, hit your number, and you'll feel so much better, when that's not the truth, right? There were times like Clyde or Rhett when I didn't view people as people, but I viewed them as employees, as vehicles of productivity. There is a fire that's in Rose that can be in myself. There is the experiences of Darren distancing himself from the people that he loved because he thought that he was set on a path in this organization where he was changing the world. That also not only happened to me, but I also did it, right? I'm not trying to paint Darren or myself as a victim. I consciously made those decisions. There are the aspects of leadership qualities that we see in Rhett, you know, the charisma and all of that. A bit of that comes from my own experience. The better parts of me might be infused in Ma. You know, you see a little bit of the playfulness in someone like Wally Cat. I would say, Whitney, that there are reflections of parts of myself in all characters.
And our final question is from Stella. And Stella would like to know, if you had to recommend authors to read or explore to your 16-year-old self, apart from James Baldwin, who would you recommend to read?
Ooh, Stella, that's a tough one. Who would I recommend to read? 16 years old. I'm trying to think of who and how I was back then and what I would be able to consume consciously and something that I'd be able to understand. Anne Petrie, who wrote The Street. That's a wonderful book that many people don't discuss. I would recommend Anne Petrie. I would recommend someone who I brought up earlier, John A. Williams, Chester Himes. If we're talking about today, again, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. I would recommend a book called Everybody Looking. It is billed as YA, but I read it as an adult last year and loved it. It's by my friend Candace Elo, Everybody Looking, and it's written in verse. You can never go wrong with Jason Reynolds, even if his
amazing writer. Everything he writes is so
everyone
good.
loves him, even if his books skew middle grade and young adults. Seeing the smile on your face right now, Zoe, right? Adults love his books.
Yeah.
There are so many other writers. He's controversial now. He was probably controversial back then, but I even enjoy Philip Roth. I like a lot of his work. The list just goes on and on and on.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for answering all my questions and all of our audience's questions. Thank you for joining us, Mateo, and I really enjoyed talking to you, and I hope you had a lovely hour.
I had the greatest hour. Thank you, Zoe. Thank you, Zoe, for inviting me, and everyone who attended. Really appreciate your attention.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that discussion. It's an absolute treat to be able to listen in. It was all really brilliant, and I'm sure anyone who hasn't yet bought or read the book will now absolutely be going out to buy it. So, as mentioned, Black Buck is now out in paperback and available to buy in bookshops and online. And of course, you can borrow it from your library. We're also really pleased to be working with the book's publisher, John Murray, to offer prison libraries in the UK free copies of the book. If you'd like to keep up to date with Mateo's writing, give him a follow on social media at Ask Mateo, or you can check out his website, mateowrites.com. To find out more about the reading agency and our work, including upcoming events like this one, you can head to our website, which is readingagency.org.uk, and follow us on social media at Reading Agency. And if you enjoyed this event, please let us know by sharing a post on social media and tagging us, because we'd really love to see your comments. And finally, we will shortly be sending out a feedback survey to get your thoughts on this event, which we'd hugely appreciate you taking a moment to complete. We read all of your feedback, and it really helps us to continue delivering free and engaging events that you want to see. So that's it for tonight. Just say again, thank you so much, Mateo and Zoe, for your brilliant discussion, and congratulations on the paperback publication of Black Buck. And yeah, good luck for everything in the future. Look forward to seeing what comes next.
Thank you all. Good evening.
Cool. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.